Welcome, everyone. This is Free School Black Studies, the Learning Series. I am your learning facilitator and guide, Professor D. Booth. And this is the final video in our 6-week lecture series. For the last month and a half, we have been developing an understanding of Black studies through an examination of liberation questions and liberation figures. And we are now coming to the end. And so, since we're coming to the end, a little bit of a recap here, right? We started with the reconsideration of the meanings of the life and politics of Rosa Parks. That was our very first week. We've since studied Malcolm X, Kwame Ture, Miriam Makeba, and Maurice Bishop. Um, and we are going to continue with our final installment, which is Audre Lorde. And I hope that you will see through today's material that in the 20th century, the Black world was much more interconnected than it might first appear. I've spoken a bit about this in some of the prior lectures, but I really want to drive that point home that it can seem that places are disparate and far away, and there are different things going on, but the Black world is really connected in a lot of interesting ways. So consider this, right? Last week we studied the revolution in the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. And studying Grenada could seem obscure considering that we are, for the study, right, situated in the United States, right? We're studying from the United States. However, there's so many connections, right? So we can note that one of the most famous Black nationalists of the 20th century was Malcolm X, who was, of course, influenced by the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey being from Jamaica. So we can see Caribbean connection there, right? But Malcolm X, actually, his mother was from Grenada, right? And she was born there sometime in the 1890s. And this would have been about the same time that Audre Lorde's mother was also born in that small island nation. And like Malcolm's mother, Lorde's mother made her way from Grenada to 20th century America, right? Um, Another connection, right, which perhaps is even more interesting to some of you, right? We have New York City based John Henrik Clarke, who is was a well known scholar of Africana studies and history. And he mentored for a time both Malcolm X and Audre Lorde, right? Both of them at different times were mentees of his. And there are other connections, right? Another example is this. As an adult, Audre Lorde traveled to Grenada to try to understand her mother's home and her own cultural inheritances. But because the island had no major airport, Lorde had to travel through Trinidad, right, to get to Grenada, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that the international airport would be built later by Maurice Bishop in his revolutionary Grenada, right? And this is one of the things that we had studied, right? But by the time that Lorde is going, it hadn't been built yet, right? It was um, some years off, right? So Audre Lorde is trying to get to Grenada, and so she has to go through Trinidad. And what is Trinidad? But the boyhood home of Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael, right? So I hope you can see that the world is not as big as it seems, right? We have this globe, and the globe is big, but the Black world, there's lots of interconnections happening, right? So even without high speed technology, there are meaningful connections in the Black world. So keep that in mind as we are moving through this lesson for today. We're going to get into the life and ideas of Audre Lorde. So let us go. And let us start here. We're jumping ahead. Let's start here. Audre Lorde captured herself in a phrase that she also used as a title of her 1984 book of essays and speeches. And the phrase was sister outsider. Sister outsider. Now, Cheryl Clarke, the author of the foreword of the 2007 edition of the book, explained this term, right? This phrase, sister outsider. And Clarke said that the term conveyed a sense of a person who occupied borders of a society. Clark says sister suggests a woman who belongs, right? However, outsiders suggest the negation of that very belonging, right? It's a paradox, as Clark is describing it, a paradox that Audre Lorde lived and theorized from. And so when I think of Audre Lorde, I think of her as sister outsider, but I often think of Audre Lorde as poet theorist, right? Not that these things are oppositional, it's just how I think about it, poet theorist. But even these words don't fully touch how Lorde identified herself. So let us get into that, right? Lorde told the world that she was many things. For example, in a public address in 1980, she described herself as, quote, a 49-year-old Black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, mother of two, including one boy, and a member of an interracial couple. That's how she identified herself, right? And these different identities were very important, for it was these many and layered and sometimes shifting identities and their engagements with the world and in the world that helped to inform Lorde's really sharp analyses. In fact, Lorde's biographer, Alexis DeVoe, put it this way, quote, she'd call herself Black, lesbian, feminist, mother, poet, warrior. Over the course of her life, Lorde used these multiple identities as passports between an array of sisterhoods, declaring with each of them, I am your sister, right? This is how her biographer put it. DeVoe ultimately concluded that Lorde was a woman who constructed a complex self. She says, its parts irreducible from the whole, right? This is her biographer, right? A complex self. You have to take it all together. Can't be reduced into any one part. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in today's lecture, I'm going to offer just rough sketches of Audre Lorde, the person, so that we can use it as a context to understand some of her political writings. And I'm going to divide my comments into two parts. The first part is about the series of life experiences, studies, artistic and political endeavors that shaped Audre Lorde as a poet theorist. I framed this section, which is the majority of the lecture, using the title of Lorde's poem called A Litany for Survival. The second shorter section of the lecture I frame as the master's tools. And the master's tools refer to a speech and a concept she developed. And I use the concept to frame a pivot in our discussion to important liberation lessons to consider from Audre Lorde's work. So that's the roadmap. But before we start, I want to strongly encourage you to read Audre Lorde's published work, her poetry, and her prose. I assigned some in the syllabus, but I do recommend that you read more of it. I also found that Alexis DeVoe's book called Warrior Poet, a biography of Audre Lorde, to be very, very informative. If you read this book, it's going to give you a portrait of the complexity and the brilliance of Lorde, like equal parts complexity and brilliance. So I strongly recommend the book. Read that book, right? Okay. Let's start. So it's appropriate for us to start with a poem, right? And this is a poem by Lorde called A Litany for Survival. And it is one of Audre Lorde's most famous poems. And it was written in 1978. And so I have it here on the screen, and I'm going to read it in full. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone, for those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So that's a litany for survival. It's a powerful poem, and one I imagine that many oppressed people relate to in many different ways. But I want to call attention to a few things as we begin to think about Lorde's work. Uh, I'll first say the poem immediately brings to my attention Lorde's understanding of being sister outsider. I hear from the words persistent fear involved in loving and being loved in a world with ever present potential to be hostile. Yet I hear faint, restrained hope. Despite the fact that she writes that she was never meant to survive, I hear that faint, strained hope, right? Um, and I shouldn't even just say she, the we, right? The saying of we never being meant to survive. I hear that hope still. In this poem, she vividly writes of people learning to fear from infancy. And that's something that struck me. It made me think about Lorde's own upbringing. And so I want us to get into that. Um, so Audre Lorde was born on February 18th, 1934 in New York City to a Grenadian mother, as we know, and a Bayesian father. He was from Barbados. And she was the youngest of three girl children. Her biographer would describe her childhood as a challenging one. Her mother and father were strict, emotionally unavailable, though they were invested in them. They wanted them to do well, be well. Worse, though, in terms of the strictness and lack of emotion, was the fact that her mother expressed a classism and colorism, which she had absorbed from her own upbringing. Lorde's mother had these ideas that lighter skinned Black people were superior. She considered darker skinned people to be generally unrefined in their habits, more common people, and undesirable to engage with in a sustained way. Uh, her Lorde's biographer explained that her mother's family even thought that Byron Lorde, who would be Audrey's father, was too dark, but they tolerated him seemingly because he was upwardly mobile. Uh, Lorde's mother believed, quote, you didn't trust anybody whose face was Black because their heart is Black, end quote. Just to give you some sense of how intense the colorism was. But what's interesting here is that her mother didn't trust white people either, right? So these kinds of views and ways of being would mean constraints for Audrey. When Audrey was born and grew aware of the world, she felt different and she felt like the odd person out from the rest of her family. She was darker than her mother and her siblings, who were particularly light skinned, and she knew her mother didn't like that fact. She was more willful than her sisters, and she knew her mother didn't like that. Um, there were not the social opportunities you would expect that Lorde would have to combat her isolation, because her mother kept her from other people in the Harlem neighborhood that they were in. She did not want her children to freely associate with others. And so, in this isolation, Audre Lorde finds and embraces poetry. And in these early years, perhaps she learned to be afraid with her mother's milk. As a young person, Lorde developed her first understandings of difference in other ways. She understood that she was different and that she openly desired closeness and physical touch from parents who offered almost none. She wants the hugs, wants the affection, but there was none. She understood that she was different when she moved from an all black school to a hostile all white school, or predominantly all white school. Um, and she understood that even when she won admission to the competitive Hunter High School, where she was less reviled and bookish on par with her peers, she was still an outsider. Right? Finally, in adolescence, she recognized she was different in her desire for closeness and community with girls and women. She knew early on that her desires were emotional, social, and eventually sexual in nature, which was different. Lorde discovered repeatedly that such differences were not positively received. In her youth, Audre Lorde experienced a significant tragedy as well. A good friend and peer who she also had romantic feelings for tragically committed suicide when she was just 15 years old. It would be a really difficult thing for Lorde. So, as we can get a sense of her coming of age was not without significant challenges. In the early 1950s, in young adulthood, after a fight, Audre Lorde left her family's stifling home and sought to make her own way in the world. She started out doing working class jobs to provide for her basic needs and to then try to put herself through Hunter College. In these years of young adulthood, Lorde would have some pretty significant experiences like becoming pregnant in 1952 and getting an illegal abortion. The experiences would stay with her and affect her understandings of the world. Lorde also had encouraging experiences too. So I want to talk about those as well. For example, she participated in the Harlem Writers Guild, which would become a very influential group on Black writers in America. It was organized by people like John Henrik Clarke, who I mentioned at the top of the lecture, Walter Christmas, Rosa Guy, and John Oliver Killens. And as I said, John Henrik Clarke would become a mentor to Audre Lorde, particularly on African history. And her association with the group gave her one of her earliest occasions to publish a poem. For a period in the 1950s, Lorde stopped going to Hunter College and worked full time. One place she worked was a factory that manufactured electronics. And this particular place involved the use of X ray machines and other hazardous materials, which Lorde handled to varying degrees. And her biographer openly wondered if exposure there could have possibly led to lasting ill health effects for Lorde. In this time, Lorde is working and she's socializing and she's making friends. And she becomes close with some folks who were active in leftist political organizations. Still, this is the 1950s, so she's experiencing the Cold War environment, and it is stifling and disheartening. And she even has some experiences with some of her friends and homophobia toward her. And so, dealing with these things and hearing about some interesting things happening in Mexico, she decides to be a student there for a short period of time, and she travels to Mexico as a student in 1954. Once in Mexico, Lord learned about culture and history and language of the culture of the country. She was there writing poetry. She met radical socialist activists who were expatriates, and she even had a romantic affair with a woman. And then she came back to the US in the summer of 1954 with a whole new wealth of living experiences. By 1955, Lord returned to Hunter College to finish her coursework. And she was not out at this time, but she moved in gay and counterculture communities in 1950s New York City. And this time period, Lord developed a way of being that her biographer described as, quote, both masculine and feminine at once. She let free and experimented with flirtatious femme and sexually aggressive butch lesbian eroticism, which was not and would not be bound by others' expectations of monogamy, end quote. So this is how she's described by her biography in this period. However, daring to be herself in 1950s America could be empowering and costly. It could be both of those things. And we can attempt to understand some of how she felt at this time by listening to her semi autobiographical, semi fictional text called Zami, a new spelling of my name that she published in 1982. So, in this clip, Audre Lorde is going to narrate, so we'll listen to a short piece of it here.
I remember how being young and black and gay and lonely felt. A lot of it was fine, feeling I had the truth and the light and the key, but a lot of it was purely hell. There were no mothers, no sisters, no heroes. We had to do it alone, like our sister Amazons, the riders on the loneliest outposts of the kingdom of Dahomey. We, young and black and fine and gay, sweated out our first heartbreaks with no school nor office chums to share that confidence over lunch hour. Just as there were no rings to make tangible the reason for our happy secret smiles, there were no names nor reasons given or shared for the tears that messed up the lab reports or the library bills. We were good listeners and never asked for double dates, but didn't we know the rules? Why did we always seem to think that friendships between women were important enough to care about? Always we moved in a necessary remoteness that made, "What did you do this weekend?" seem like an impertinent question. We discovered and explored our attention to women alone, sometimes in secret, sometimes in defiance, sometimes in little pockets that almost touched. Why are those little black girls always either whispering together or fighting? But always alone, against a greater aloneness. We did it cold turkey, and although it resulted in some pretty imaginative, tough women when we survived, too many of us did not survive at all. I remember Muff, who sat on the same seat in the same dark corner of the pony stable bar, drinking the same gin year after year. One day she slipped off onto the floor and died of a stroke right there between the stools. We found out later her real name was Josephine.
Okay. So in this clip, we can hear that she said, well, a lot of things were good, a lot of things were hell because they dared to exist in the world as themselves. They became forced outsiders and they dealt with a lot of loneliness, right? We can recall in this clip that she says, quote, "We did it cold turkey. And although it resulted in some pretty imaginative, tough women when we survived, too many of us didn't survive at all." So she's saying, speaking of the tragedy of it, that was a part of the experience. So I'll say Lord's life and work reveal, as her litany poem did, a struggle, pointing to the fact that one is not meant to survive, and yet she and others like her are struggling to live on anyway. Okay. I hope these broad strokes of Lord's life are helping us to understand that Lorde lived by and through her poetry and other writing. Lorde wrote constantly, and her writing and theories embedded within the writing helped her to process her lived experiences and those of others. She also studied independently. While Lorde had a master's degree in library science, she supplied herself with her own education beyond that. And Lorde was so respected for her knowledge that outside of publishing and speaking engagements, her day job, her mainstay, was as a college professor. So I want to reiterate that this is a sketch of Audre Lorde. So I'm skipping over great swaths of important things, significant things, but I want to point out something special about Audre Lorde. And that was this: because she cared about humanity and justice and was active in support of Black, lesbian, feminist organizing and theorizing spaces, she was often on the scene of some of America's most important social events. Yet she was not always fully embraced, right? Instead, Lorde, who was public with her lesbianism by 1973, was Sister Outsider. Yet to understand Lorde's importance, I have a slide here with a sample of some of those important events because I do think it's important to just get a sense of her. All right. And so here are a couple of events. All right. She was present in 1963 at the March on Washington. She, with her then husband, traveled to DC as an interracial couple with some friends at a time when their union was outlawed in nearby Virginia. Right. Moreover, it can seem that in retrospect, many people were, in the streets and doing sit-ins and going to the March on Washington. But in reality, it was just a subset of people who were doing that, right? At the March on Washington, only 250,000 people went. And among them was Audre Lorde, right? Indeed, Lorde was invited or created space for herself at many history making events or developments over the years. For example, she briefly taught poetry at Tougaloo College in Mississippi in 1968 as Black power was rising in prominence. And Tougaloo College has important civil rights history. So I encourage you to look into that, right? So it's just significant that she's going to Mississippi and doing this work. As an instructor at City College in New York in 1969, Lorde supported Black and Puerto Rican students protesting for greater college access for students in their communities, right? They want people who they're growing up with, who they're seeing, to also have access to college. Lorde participated in Pan-African gatherings like the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture in 1977. And that was a who's who of Black cultural and political leaders. It was held, I believe, in Nigeria, West Africa. And throughout this time, Audre Lorde was, of course, writing and seeking out publishing for her poetry. And her work was taking on various themes, including Black liberation struggle. We can consider that in 1978, she wrote a poem published for the Black political activist Assata Shakur. And that's the same Assata Shakur who would help Kwame Ture in the 1990s with his cancer treatment in Cuba when she was in exile. But I digress. Back to Audre Lorde. In 1979, she had been a champion for lesbian and feminist causes and Black liberation for years. And so she was asked and agreed to give the keynote address to the first National Third World Gay and Lesbian Conference in 1979. The conference had been timed to occur with the first national march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. And Lorde was invited to be a speaker there too. And so she addressed a massive crowd of about 100,000 people. And if you, on the slide here, is an image of Lorde at that historic gathering. I can go on and I'll go on for a little bit, just a little bit more. All right. She was a co founder and early supporter of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in 1980. Really important in getting Black women scholarship and other women of color, their work out into the world. She organized support for anti apartheid activism through a group called Sisterhood in support of sisters in South Africa. That was in 1981. She protested the US invasion in Grenada and visited in the immediate aftermath of the failed revolution and US occupation in 1983. Um, yeah, bold stuff. Right afterwards. She even came full circle and addressed the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington in 1983. And she did so despite the fact that some of the conference organizers shamefully required that she have her remarks reviewed before she went to speak. Lorde, pushed back and spoke her piece anyway. She allowed them to review it, but she spoke her piece anyway. Over the years, Audre Lorde supported efforts that developed Black women's studies. Lorde also protested police brutalities and killings, and she certainly remained a leading theorizer in the feminist movement. Okay, so these are decades of work that Audre Lorde is doing, and it cements her as one of the most important political activists in the 20th century in America in multiple arenas. And from this important work and writing came very important insights to which we now turn as we wrap up this lecture. All right, we are going to consider her concepts on the master's tools. Okay, so Audre's life and studies led her to the conclusion that, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Okay. So we want to think through this here. But first, what are the master's tools? Well, simply put, they are those items, systems, beliefs, and more that are employed by oppressors to keep a hierarchy and people oppressed, right? And one such tool is something that Lorde called a mythic norm. And so she talks about it in the 1980 talk, right? So she's lived all these years, right? Has processed these ideas, has been studying on her own, and she's giving this talk in 1980, and it's called Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. And Lorde says the following, quote, somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there is what I call a mythic norm, which each one of us has within our hearts, which each one of us within our hearts knows that is not me. In America, that norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. It is within this mythic norm that the trappings of power reside within society. Those of us who stand outside that power often identify one way in which we are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting other distortions around difference, some of which we ourselves may be practicing. By and large, within the women's movement today, white women focus upon their oppression as women and often ignore differences of race, sexual preference, class, and age. There is a pretense to homogeneity of experience covered by the word sisterhood that does not, in fact, exist. Okay, so this passage is a bit dense, but let's see if we can't pull out some elements here. So we have Lorde pointing out that we have all been trained to believe a mythic norm exists, right? This is what she's saying is on the edge of our consciousness, okay? And the mythic norm is the idealized person who has power in society, the person at the top of the hierarchy with the benefits and the most power, and we could colloquially call them the man, Okay. And in our minds, the man is white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure, right? All the things. Okay. Lord then explains for those who are not the mythic norm, right? Not the man, everybody who's not the man, we assume that there's one major way that we don't measure up to the man in power. And that one thing is of the greatest consequence and why we experience oppression or lack of power. For example, a Black person might say, I don't have the power and privileges of the man because I'm Black. Or a poor person might say, I don't have the power and privileges of the man because I'm poor. Or a white woman might say, I don't have the power and privileges of the man because I'm a woman. But Lord says that such people miss the fact that there are actually multiple oppressions happening through the mythic norm of the man at once. And failure to recognize this fact makes all of those persons liable to being unaware of the power and privileges they do have to be the man, right? In this excerpt, she points to white women and she says that white women are fighting fiercely to end gender oppression, believing it to be the most important oppression of all, and ignoring how the mythic norm, by its existence, creates multiple oppressions. Now, by ignoring these oppressions, just to fight the one, Lord points out that the women essentially acquiesce to the maintenance of the other oppressive norms, and their complicity makes them the man too. Lord ends this excerpt explaining that a sisterhood that ignores differences of, quote, race, sexual preference, class, and age cannot be a true sisterhood because one sister acquiesces to the oppression of another. In sum, Lord is pointing out if we do not destroy the mythic norm entirely and embrace differences widely, then we are not truly invested in liberation from oppression. So let me say a bit more. Lord reinforces the idea of fighting oppression on all fronts and raises the stakes with the following quote from the same talk, right? She says, quote, the future of Earth may depend upon the ability of all women to identify and develop new definitions of power and new patterns of relating across difference. The old definitions have not served us, nor the earth that supports us. The old patterns, no matter how cleverly rearranged to imitate progress, still condemn us to cosmetically altered repetitions of the same old exchanges, the same old guilt, hatred, recrimination, lamentation, and suspicion. For we have built into all of us old blueprints of expectation and response, old structures of oppression, and these must be altered at the same time as we alter the living conditions which are a result of those structures. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Lord insists that we recognize the hierarchy, the exclusion, are tools of the master, and we can't get to freedom acting like oppressors. Instead, she implores us to embrace difference and in doing so, discover a new power to change the world for the better. Okay, so we've finally come to the end. Gone to the end, good people. The end of the lesson on Audre Lorde and the end of the lecture series. And I'd like for us to wrap up by considering connections and using Lorde as a means to think through one last liberation question. So in week 3, we listened to Kwame Ture as he gave a lecture on his lessons from the 1960s. And in that talk, he asserted the importance of organization and revolutionary Pan-Africanism to transform the world into one that is safe, healthy, and life-affirming for Black people. With that in mind, I want you to consider this last excerpt from Audre Lorde in a talk she wrote called Learning the 60s, right? I'm sorry, Learning from the 60s. So, um, this is a talk that she delivered as a part of Malcolm X Week at Harvard University in 1982. So this should tell you something interesting, right? Like we have now major, some of the most elite institution, not only in the United States, but in the world in the 1980s, having space on its campus for people to seriously think through Malcolm X and devoting resources for folks to come and be able to talk about it. Right. This is something to think about here. And anyway, she's here, right? She's delivering a talk, right? And she's giving these comments as a person who lived through the 1960s herself. And I'm interested to know from your thoughts, how do her lessons compare with Touré's? Okay, so here's an excerpt from that. She says, quote, if our history has taught us anything, it is that action for change directed only against the external conditions of our oppressions is not enough. In order to be whole, we must recognize the despair oppression plants within each of us, that thin, persistent voice that says our efforts are useless. It will never change, so why bother? Accept it. We must fight that inserted piece of self destruction that lives and flourishes like a poison inside of us, unexamined until it makes its turn upon ourselves and each other. But we can put our finger down upon that loathing buried deep within each one of us and see who encourages us to despise. And we can lessen its potency by the knowledge of our real connectedness, arsing across our differences. Hopefully, we can learn from the 60s that we cannot afford to do our enemy's work by destroying each other. Okay, so that's the statement. And what I want to know is, what do you make of the statement? Given what we've learned from the freedom struggles in the past 6 weeks, how might vigorous embrace of difference produce liberatory power in our world as it exists today? What else might we need? Right? That's the question. Okay, so I want you to sit with it, think about the quote, right? If you can find the speech, go for it, and it's in the Sister Outsider book, and read the whole thing and think about it, right? And we will pick it up in discussion on Thursday. That's it. Okay. I want to thank you very much for journeying with me for these 6 weeks in the summertime. You could have been chilling, but you're here doing this work. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. If you have been gaining from this experience and you want to do more, learn more, stay tuned. I'm going to post a short video on the channel soon, and it's going to be about Free School Black Studies, the film and book club, right? And so this is a new initiative, and it'll be launching in September. So there'll be a short video to give you more details if you're interested in that. So just check back on the channel and make sure you have notification, and it'll come to you. But that's it for now. I hope to see you on Thursday. And until then, each one, teach one. Peace.